Hey guys, it's Jen. So I am here today with my summer reading wrap-up. So I haven't posted a wrap-up since May, and that was my April wrap-up. So today I am going to talk about books that I read in May, June, July, and August. So that is 4 months of books. So I read 36 books this summer, which averages out to about 9 books a month. So I'm only going to be talking about like 20 of those books today, which I know seems like a lot, but I'm mostly going to be doing short little reviews, especially for ones that fell more in the middle of the curve. So I have a stack of my favorite books that I read over this summer, a stack of books that were my least favorite or most disappointing, and then I also have a stack of books that weren't necessarily my favorite or my least favorite, or I didn't really have a strong opinion about them, but I still wanted to talk about them or recommend them. So first up, for those sort of middle books, is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'm not saying this wasn't a great book. It was a great book. It just maybe wasn't one of my favorite books that I've ever read, but I still really enjoyed it. I can't wait to see the TV show that they make out of it. I think it's going to be on Hulu, and I don't know when that starts, but I'm really excited for it because I really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it. Next, I have The Sudden Appearance of Hope by Claire North, and I enjoyed it. It's about a woman who only stays in people's memory for as long as she's like standing in front of them, interacting with them. So it was a really interesting story about how she lives her life. So I really enjoyed this book, but it did not stick with me the way that the first 15 Lives of Harriet August did, which is why it's more of a middle-of-the-road book, but I still definitely recommend it. I also read The Invisible Library by Genevieve Cogman. This is the first book in a planned trilogy. This book is about a woman who works for a library and collects books, but books from like many different dimensions. So in this first story, she travels to a sort of steampunky version of London with her assistant to collect a book. I don't really remember the plot that well. I just remember that I really liked it, and I'm really looking forward to reading the second and third books. The next sort of middle book is The Nest by Cynthia D'Aprix Sweeney. This book got a lot of buzz over the summer, which is why I picked it up. I thought it was good, but not great. It was told from the viewpoints of a few different characters, so there were obviously some that I related to more than others, and some stories that I was much more interested in. I thought it was definitely worth reading, although I would definitely maybe borrow it from the library or wait till it comes out in paperback instead of buying the hardcover to add to your collection unless you really love it. Next, I have Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I am a big fan of Brandon Sanderson's work, and this is actually the first novel he published, and you can really tell. It's not as sophisticated, I think, as his later works. The magic system is very interesting. The characters and the storyline I was very invested in. I did feel like the pacing was a little off. I felt the main character, Serene, I really loved her, but after I finished reading the book, I realized she was maybe a little bit of a Mary Sue, but I didn't notice as much when I was reading it because I really liked her character, and she's the kind of female character that I really love in fantasy, one who doesn't want to fight all of her problems with swords and is much more politically inclined, so I really enjoyed that. But at the end of the book, after I finished it and thought about it for a little bit, I was like, I can see why people say she's a little bit of a Mary Sue. It does make sense. So this was a good book, but Brandon Sanderson has definitely improved, so maybe if you haven't read Sanderson before, don't start with this one. So also over the summer, I finally finished Margaret Atwood's Mad Adam trilogy. I read Oryx and Crake earlier this year, and so I read the second 2 books in the trilogy, The Year of the Flood and Mad Adam. Overall, I really enjoyed this trilogy. All of the books in the trilogy are told from the point of view of different characters. All 3 of them have narratives that are in the past and in the present. So the past is their like dystopian world, and then the present is their dystopian world after like an apocalyptic event. And then in Year of the Flood, we actually have 2 POVs of 2 female characters, Wren and Toby, who were part of this cult, God's Gardeners, in the dystopian era, and then we follow them after the apocalypse has happened when they're both sort of isolated and on their own, to just sort of see how they deal with that. The third book follows Zeb, who is also a part of the God's Gardener cult, but then talks about his time before the cult as well, pretty extensively. and about how he also is dealing with this post-apocalyptic world. And it's very interesting because the characters are all very connected, and when you read the first one, you know, it's sort of on its own, but then as you read the rest of the trilogy, it all sort of builds together. So I really liked it. But Year of the Flood was definitely my favorite. My last sort of mediocre book of the summer was Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, based on a story by J.K. Rowling, but written by Jack Thorne. So, there have been a lot of mixed reviews about this book, and those reviews are well deserved. This was I don't know. I didn't really enjoy this as much as I wanted to, but I don't feel like anything I read in the Harry Potter world is ever going to be as enjoyable to me as reading the books for the first time. So, you know, you could just tell it wasn't written by J.K. Rowling. I actually have friends who have seen the play in London, and I talked to them about it, and I said, what did you think? And it comes across much better as a play, apparently, than it does as a book. So hopefully I will get the opportunity to see it as a play sometime in the future, and until then I'm really going to hold off on talking extensively about this because I feel like a lot of other people have, and I feel like I don't have the full picture of how it is supposed to be since I have not seen it as the play. So, okay. Let's move on to the books that I read this summer that were the most disappointing and that I just sort of hated the most. Alright, let's do it. Yeah, so the first one I have is Maestra by L.S. Hilton. I was so excited for this book when I picked it up, but this book was terrible. I recommend it to no one. I was just so annoyed by it. This book was trying so hard to be so many different things, and it did none of them well. She's an assistant at an auction house in London, and she discovers what could be this big scandal, and so she wants to investigate it. She also works at a nightclub and is kind of a sex worker. And then it turns into this thriller where she loves murder. So this book just was it had too much going on, and honestly, I couldn't really get behind it or get into it. And then, at the end, it was like, to be continued, and I was like, no, I don't want to continue with this character. I do not like her, and I did not like this book, so this was very disappointing to me. Another book that I read this summer that I really did not enjoy is The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks. I even spilled soda on this book, and I just don't even care, because I'm not keeping it. The only reason I've kept it so long is so that I can hold it up in a video and go, don't read this. So I read and didn't enjoy the Sword of Shannara, and thought, well, maybe The Elfstones of Shannara is better because this is the one that they decided to base the TV show on. So, this is a bad thing to say, but I enjoyed the TV show much more than I enjoyed this book. But I didn't really enjoy this. I didn't like the writing, I didn't like the characters. So I'm definitely not going to be continuing with Terry Brooks's books, and I'm actually going to be getting rid of both of these. Another disappointing book of the summer was At the Water's Edge by Sarah Gruen. So I read Water for Elephants a long time ago. I think I was in high school when that came out and I read it because it was like the book to read. So one of my friends told me she loved this book, so I decided to pick it up. The main character, Madeline, and her husband go to Scotland to search for the Loch Ness Monster. That sounds so cool, but it's not really a magical realism story or anything like that. It's more of a character study, but I didn't like the characters. I just didn't enjoy it as much as I wanted to. It just didn't live up to my expectations. So it wasn't a bad book. I think I ended up giving it a 3 stars, but it definitely was a disappointment to me. And I think maybe it's because it's been so many years since I read Water for Elephants, and my tastes have really grown since then. The Vegetarian by Hong Kong is another disappointing read of the summer. So this won the Man Booker International Prize, which is for translated literature, so this is translated from Korean. I really want to read more diverse, more translated literature, so I picked it up when I heard that it had won a prize. I really liked the cover, I saw it in a bookshop, and so I just picked it up. The main character decides that she wants to be a vegetarian one day and doesn't really give any explanation to her husband or her family. Points of view in this story follow her husband, her brother-in-law and her sister. So we never really get inside the head of the main character, which I felt really took away from this story for me, because I really wanted to know why did you choose to be a vegetarian? Why are you behaving this way? And so I felt like, you know, we just get like perspectives and opinions on her sudden life change from these other characters, but we never really get inside her head. So I was a little disappointed, and I didn't really like this as much as I wanted to. Another YA book that I read that was disappointing was Paper and Fire by Rachel Caine. So Ink and Bone by Rachel Caine, the first book in this planned trilogy, was one of my favorite books last year. It's a YA book that takes place in sort of an alternate universe where the Great Library of Alexandria controls the world. The main character, Jess Brightwell, is from London and goes to study in Alexandria to become a librarian, even though he is from a family that steals books. And I was just so intrigued by the world and the characters and everything about it. I loved it. And so this second book sort of fell flat for me. I had a few problems with it, just like the plot and the pacing just bothered me. And there was also, you know, this plot line with this one character that was very problematic that I don't really want to get into because of spoilers, but I just really didn't enjoy it. Although at the end of the book, it looks like for the third book, they're going to be going to Philadelphia, to the United States, and so I will probably pick it up, but I don't think I am going to buy it or Paper and Fire unless it's excellent. And the last disappointing book of summer was The Girls by Emma Cline. This book got a lot of buzz and a lot of hype, which is why I picked it up. It was a bestseller, and it takes place in the 60s in California, and it's sort of a retelling of the Manson murders. So the main character in this, Evie, she spent some time living with the cult and was like a little bit involved with them, and so it tells mostly the story of her coming of age in California in that era. It could have been good, but I was just never really sold on it. The writing is beautiful, but I just really didn't like the plot or the characters, and it just let me down. It was a little disappointing. And so now we finally get to my favorite books of the summer. The first book I want to talk about is The Lightkeepers by Abby Genai. I am so glad that I read this book. So it is about a woman who is a photographer, and she goes to live on these isolated islands off the coast of California. So she lives there for a year with these other people who are biologists, and they are studying the different animals that make the islands their home. It's isolated, it's a very closed environment, and just the story, my god, it's so interesting and so worthwhile to read, because it does talk a lot about animals and nature and sort of like conservation and wildlife. How the main character sort of uses the images of like the birds and the whales and all of that sort of stuff to relate to what's going on in her own life. And then you also have almost thriller-esque aspects to it, because there is some heavy stuff that goes down on the island. It's really traumatic for the main character, very traumatic, and I just really loved it. I gave this book 5 stars. It was just beautifully written, and I felt that these very difficult subject matters were handled incredibly well, and I just loved it. Another excellent book that I read this summer is The Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu. So this is a collection of sci-fi and fantasy short stories, which I was so excited about when I heard about this book, because when you read short story collections, they're usually much more literary. And I was really in the mood for some sci-fi fantasy, and so it took me a while to read this book, mostly because I would read the short stories one at a time and sort of savor them for a little bit in between other books that I was reading. So I thought this short story collection was excellent, and I've actually even picked up Ken Liu's novel The Grace of Kings because I was so enchanted by this collection. Obviously, as with any short story collection, there are some that you like much more than others. I feel like you don't have to be a hardcore reader of sci-fi and fantasy to enjoy this collection, but I definitely recommend checking out 1 or 2 of the stories to see if you like them. So my next favorite is actually a reread, and the only classic that I read over the summer, and that is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I have not read Wuthering Heights since I was in high school, and I felt like my opinion on it probably has changed and matured since high school. And it definitely has. It's still a really good book. I still really enjoy it, but I feel like now that I've read it as an adult and I know a lot more about the Bronte sisters, I could definitely appreciate it a lot more. It is a classic for a reason. So definitely highly recommend if you haven't read it before, or if you have read it before, read it again and see what you think now. My next favorite of the summer is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. The first part of this book was really a struggle for me to get through. It took me a few days to read, about the first third before I really got into this book. I did really enjoy it. N.K. Jemisin's writing style and world is just so unique that I couldn't help but get pulled in once I was more invested in the story. So there are 3 main narratives in the story, and they follow characters who are at different points in their lives. And I don't really want to give too much away because there was a reveal where I was like, oh my god, of course. So yes, but this is a fantasy novel. I liked it a lot once I really got into it. There is one narrative strand that is a little bit more stream of consciousness, so that one was a little bit of a struggle for me to read since I don't typically enjoy that type of writing. Yeah, there was some really interesting characterization and really interesting like plot and world building ideas in this, and so I was definitely hooked once I got more into it, about a third of the way through. So if at first you don't like it, maybe give it another chance and see if you can get a little farther. It'll definitely draw you in, because once I hit a certain point in this novel, I finished the rest in a day. So, The Fifth Season. Another book that I loved this summer is Dear Fang with Love by Rufi Thorpe. It's about a relationship between a father and daughter, really. The main character is Lucas, who's the father. So he had his daughter when he was very young, about 17, and didn't really have a part in raising her or her upbringing because her mother sort of took care of that, but he still wants to be a part of his life now that she's sort of a teenager, and he wants to try harder to be a good father. So he decides to take his daughter Vera on a trip to Lithuania to learn more about like his ancestry and like his family history, because the daughter Vera has always been raised in her mother's like Russian household, is very Russian, and so he really wants her to appreciate his heritage as well, so they go to Lithuania. The story is very interesting. So the main narrative is told from Lucas's point of view, and then in between chapters we get the letters that Vera is writing to her boyfriend back home. It was just a really interesting literary story about like father and daughter relationships and how he's trying to repair his relationship with her, but how there's like a whole lot of other stuff going on in her life that he's not necessarily aware of because, you know, being a dad is hard. So I definitely enjoyed this and I would recommend it. Another of the great books that I read this summer was A Court of Mist and Fury by Sarah J. Maas. I was initially a little reluctant to read this book because I didn't really enjoy A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is the previous book in the series. I felt that one was just a little blah, a little bit like not my favorite, and so I wasn't even sure if I was going to continue with the series. And then one of my friends, who had also thought the first book was a little bit blah, read this one and was raving about how good it was. So I was like, oh, I need to check this out. So I read it, and it is so much better than the first one. Like, if you just read the first one and thought it wasn't for you because you weren't really a fan of what was happening with, like, the love interest and the plot, like, think again. Think again. I have so many feelings on A Court of Mist and Fury that I can't even explain them without spoilering, but I just really loved it. I thought it was such an improvement from the first book. That's why it clawed its way to the top of my summer reading, because it was just such a nice surprise after the sort of mediocrity of the first book. Okay, and my final great read of the summer is Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett. So I picked it up and I read it and I loved it, and I can definitely see why this is such a cult favorite. It was so humorous and so quirky and so eccentric, and I just loved it. It was just so good. And I definitely recommend it if you haven't read it before. Even if you haven't read any of Neil Gaiman's or Terry Pratchett's writing, this is a really good place to start. It really shows off their humor and their writing style, and I just really loved it. Okay, so that is it for my summer reading 2016. If you want to see the rest of the books that I read this summer, be sure to check out my Goodreads page. If you want to see what I'm going to be reading next, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!